Hey folks, in this episode I'm going to show you how to make this geometry node text animation loop here. It's quite a cool text motion graphic. It should be a fairly straightforward tutorial. It's not too complicated, so without further ado, let's get to it. So open up Blender, and as always we're going to go to Edit, Preferences, go to Add-ons, and then search for Node Wrangler, and then enable the Node Wrangler here. And when you've done that, we're going to click this button here and we'll click Save Preferences, and that will ensure the Node Wrangler loads every time we load Blender. And then we'll click this button here, close that window. I'll then navigate over to my render tab over here. I'm going to change it from Eevee to cycles. You can keep yours set to Eevee if you like, but I prefer cycles because it gives better results. I'll also change my device type from CPU to GPU. I'll then go to my output tab over here. I'm going to enable render region, and I've got my frame rate set to 30 FPS. I'm also going to change my end frame to 240. So we've got 240 frames on our timeline. I'll just take my cursor to the bottom left of the 3D viewport until I see a crosshair. I'm going to left click and drag up and open up a new window. I'll then click this button here, and I'm going to change it from the 3D viewport to the timeline. And you should see 240 frames in your timeline. Excellent. And with my cursor in the timeline, I'm going to hit N to hide the N panel. Maybe I'll just drag this window down to give us a bit more space. I'll then take my cursor to the bottom left of the 3D viewport again until I see the crosshair. I'm going to left click and drag up and open up a new window. I'll then change this from the 3D viewport to Geometry Node Editor. And with the default cube selected, I'm going to click New in my Geometry Node Editor, and that will add a new Geometry Node tree there. Excellent. I'll then hit N to hide the N panel. I'll just increase this window. I guess the first thing we need to do is add some text. So I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for string to curves. I'll just pop that there for now. I'll then plug the curve instances into the geometry socket of the group output. I'll just zoom out. I'm going to box select these. I'm going to hit G just to give us a bit more space. If you haven't used the string to curves node before for generating text, it's really simple to input text. We just go to this string box here, left click, and then type in whatever you like. I'm going to type in level up. I'll then hit enter, and in my 3D viewport I'm just going to hit numpad 7 to go into top view, and as you can see we've got our text. I'm going to change the alignment from left to center, and I'll also change the baseline from top to middle. I'll then click this file icon here, and I'm going to change my font to something a bit more appropriate, maybe Arial Black. That seems like a good enough font for me. I'll then click open font. So the settings on this string to curves is pretty straightforward. We've got the size, we've got the character spacing, we've got word spacing, and we've also got line spacing. This would work if we had a paragraph. So if I change my text box width, and then we can change the spacing there. I'll just change this back to 0. Currently this curve instance has limited points on it, so I want to resample this curve to give it more points, and that's so the animation that traces around the text is a lot smoother. So next up I want to resample this curve, so I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for resample, and we'll choose resample curve, and I'll pop that in there. And as you can see, this resample curve does exactly what it says on the tin. It resamples the curve. So I'm going to have a count of, let's say, 256. And that should give us quite a high resolution to trace around this with the animation. So the next node I'm going to add will be a trim curve. So I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for trim, and I'll choose the trim curve node here, and I'll pop that there. So now if I increase the start factor or decrease the end factor, you can see what's happening. Now currently this is a curve which has no geometry, so we wouldn't see this in a render. So I'm just going to zoom out. I'm going to take this trim curve down to round about here perhaps. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for curve to mesh, and I'll pop that in between there. I'll then hit Shift A, search for curve circle, and I'll pop that down here, and this curve circle will act as the profile for the curve to mesh. I'll then reduce the radius to, let's say, 0.01. Excellent. Forget about these 3 nodes for the minute. I'll then plug this resample curve into the geometry group output, and now I want to fill in this text. So I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for fill curve, and I'll pop that in between there. I also want to extrude the text, so I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for extrude, and we'll choose extrude mesh, and I'll pop that in there. Maybe I'll just orbit round in my 3D viewport. Obviously that's way too much, so maybe I'll set an offset of, let's say, 0.1, maybe 0.25. Okay, I'll be happy with that. We are going to have a slight problem with some of the normals. So if I navigate to my overlays over here, I'll click this arrow button, and I'm going to enable face orientation. Now everything should be grey, and if anything's red, it's going to need flipping. So if I orbit round to the bottom, you can see that these bottom faces are pointing in the wrong direction. To resolve this, what we need to do is we need to flip the normals of this original geometry here. So now, if I hit Shift A and I'm going to search for flip, and we'll choose flip faces, and I'll pop that in between the fill curves node and the group output. I'll just drag this up here, and as you can see, we've got grey on the bottom and red on the inside. Excellent. Now we just need to join these two together. So I'm going to hit Shift A and I'll search for join, and we'll choose join geometry, and I'll pop that in there. I'll then plug this extrude mesh into the bottom socket. So now the top and bottom are grey. Excellent. I can now go to my overlays over here, and I'll disable face orientation. Excellent. I'm going to take this join geometry node, I'm going to hit Shift D and I'm going to pop it in between there. I'll then plug the mesh socket from the curve to mesh into the bottom socket of the join geometry, and now you can see that the outline is appearing at the bottom there. So maybe we need to flip the offset for the extrude mesh. So for the offset, I'm going to type in -0.25, and now it's at the top. Excellent. For the moment, I'm going to mute the 3D text and we'll just focus on the outline. So I'm going to take this mesh socket from the curve to mesh and plug it into the geometry group output. I'll just hit numpad 7. Next up, I want to add icospheres at the start and end of each of these curves. That should be easy enough. So I'm just going to drag this up. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to search for instance on points, and I'll pop that below the curve to mesh. I'll then connect the output from the trim curve into the point socket of the instance on points. I'll hit Shift A and I'm going to search for icosphere, and I'll pop that there. I'll then connect the mesh socket to the instance socket on the instance on points. I'll then connect this instance socket to the geometry socket of the group output. Okay, it's a complete mess at the moment, so we need to reduce the radius of the icosphere. So maybe as a starting point, I'm going to type in 0.1. Needs to go smaller than that, so I'm going to type in 0.025. Okay, I'll now increase the subdivisions to, let's say, 3. So obviously, I don't want icospheres to be generated on each point. I literally just want them to be generated on the start and the end of each curve. So we need to isolate the start and end for this spline. Luckily, there's a node for that. So I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to type in endpoint, and we'll choose endpoint selection. I'll then connect this selection socket from the endpoint selection into the selection socket of the instance on points. So now, if I connect this instance on points to this join geometry node, and then click the join geometry node to the group output, I'll just zoom out a bit. And now, if I animate this start and end factor, you can see that the icospheres are tracing around the text. Excellent. Moving forward, instead of having to keyframe this start and end factor in the geometry nodes, we're going to add automation so we can access it in our modifier over here. So I'm just going to drag this window across over to here. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to search for scene time, and I'll pop this over here. I'll hit Shift A and I'm going to search for math, and we choose a math node. I'll then hit Shift D to duplicate the math node and pop it there. This first math node we're going to set to multiply, and this second math node we're going to set to fraction. I'll plug the seconds in the top socket of the multiply node and the value from the multiply node into the socket of the fraction node. And maybe for now I'm just going to set the speed to, let's say, 0.2. I can now drive the start and end point with this fraction. So in the start point, if I hit play, you can see that the trace disappears. I'll skip back to frame 1. I'll swap it from start to end, and you can see that the trace is drawn. I'll just skip back to frame 1. So I want to drive the start and end with this fraction, but we're going to offset it with a float curve. So if I just box select these 3 nodes here, I'm going to hit G and drag them across over to here. I'll then take this value and plug it into the start socket. And now, if I hit play, you'll just see these icospheres trace around. So I'll just skip back to frame 1. I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for float, and we're going to choose float curve. And I'll pop that in between the fraction and the start point. I'll then hit Shift D to duplicate that, and I'll pop it in between the fraction and the end point. I'll just drag this down. I'll drag this across. Just drag these across too. Now to offset the start and end, it's really easy. I'm going to take this float curve, I'm going to drag this point all the way across over to here, and I'm going to give it a value of, let's say, 0.5. And then for this bottom float curve up here, where it finishes at 0.5 on this one, we want this top one to finish at 0.5 up here. So for here, I'm going to type in 0.5. Now, if I was to hit play, you can see that it's being traced, and then the trace disappears, and it should loop perfectly Now if yours doesn't loop, for example, say like my value was set to 0.35, all I'll do is I'll hit play until it does one complete cycle. I'll just push pause before it gets to the end. I'm going to skip forward a couple of frames. I'll just skip back one more frame so this first icosphere doesn't go past this one. And we know that frame 85 would be the loop frame, so I'll then set my end frame to 85. And now if I was to hit play, you should see that it does a full cycle. Excellent. So I'm just going to change my end frame back to frame 240, and I'm going to change the speed on my multiply node to 0.2. I'm going to move on to materials now, so I'm just going to skip to a frame where there's quite a bit of trace and all my icospheres are visible. I'll then navigate to the material tab over here. You should have a default material already set. If you don't, just click new. I'll then click this plus button and I'm going to click new to add another material. I'm going to click the plus button one more time, click new, and that will add another material. So for the first material, I'm going to call this A. The second material, I'm going to call B. And the third material, I'm going to call C. So for material A, I'm going to keep this as a principal BSDF, and I'm going to change it to white, and I'm going to give 100% roughness. For material B, I'm going to change this from the principal BSDF to emission, and I'm going to change the color to blue. I'm also going to set a strength of 8. For material C, I'm going to change it from the principal BSDF to emission. I'm going to change the color to orange, and I'm going to give a strength of 8. That will do for now. Maybe I can just decrease this window slightly. I'll then take my cursor to the top left of the 3D viewport until I see a crosshair. I'm going to left click and drag across and open up a new window. I'll then change this from the 3D viewport to the shader editor. I'll then hit N to hide the N panel, and I'll just zoom in. So we've got slot A, slot B, and slot C. Excellent. I want to expose these settings in my modifier, so I'm going to navigate to my modifier tab over here, and with your group input node over here, if you haven't got one, just hit Shift A and search for group and choose group input. I'm going to go to my string to curves node. I'm going to delete level up, delete, hit enter. I'll then connect this string socket to the group input. I'm going to hit N to open up the in panel, and under your group tab up here, and where it says string, we're going to rename this to text input. And then on my modifiers over here where it says text input, I'm going to type in level up. I'll then go to my geometry node window. I'm going to connect the size and the character spacing. Maybe I can connect the word spacing too. And on the end panel where it says size, I'm going to rename this to text size. I'll just drag my node window over to here. The next thing I want to expose is the extrusion amount. So I'm going to connect this offset socket from the extrude mesh into the bottom socket of the group input. I'm going to go over to my end panel, and I'm going to rename the offset scale to extrude scale. Next up, I want to expose this multiply node down here, which is going to be the speed. So I'm going to drag this value socket into the bottom socket of the group input, and on your end panel, I'm going to scroll down until it says value, and I'm going to replace this with speed control. Next up, I want to be able to control the radius of the icospheres. So I'm going to drag this radius socket from the icosphere into the bottom socket of the group input. I'm going to navigate to my end panel. I'm going to scroll down until I see radius, and I'll replace this with icosphere radius. The next value I want to expose will be this curve radius. So I'm going to drag this radius from the curve circle into the bottom socket of the group input. I'll then navigate to the end panel. I'm going to scroll down until I see radius, and I'm going to replace this with curve radius. I also want to expose the materials on this group output so we can change the materials on the fly. But as you can see, if I go into rendered view, it's all got the same material. So we need to bring in the materials in geometry nodes. That's easy enough. So I'm just going to take these two nodes here. I'm going to hit G. I'm going to drag them across over to here. I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for set, and we'll choose set material. I'll pop that there. I hit Shift D to duplicate, and I pop it in between there. I'll then hit Shift D to duplicate it one more time, and I pop it in between there. For the top one, we're going to choose material A. For the next one, we're going to use material B, and for the icospheres, we're going to choose material C. So now you can see we've got the materials. In fact, I'm going to navigate to my world tab over here, and I'm going to disable the strength of the world. I'll also select the light and my outliner, and I'm going to hit delete. Okay, it's looking quite good so far. So I'll just select my geometry node text object. I'll just re-enable my modifier tab over here. So now we need to connect these material sockets into our group input over here. But instead of dragging them all the way across the screen, I'm just going to add another group input. So I hit Shift A and I'm going to search for group and we'll choose group input. I'll just drag this up here. So the socket from material A will go into the bottom socket. The socket from material B will go into the next socket down. And the socket from material C will also go into the bottom socket. I'll just make this window a bit bigger. So for the top material, we're going to rename this to base material. And for the second material slot, we're going to rename this to trace material. And for this bottom material socket, we're going to rename this to sphere material. So we've got base material, trace material and sphere material, and we can change these on the fly. Now you see where it says extrude scale on the geometry node modifier, we've got this icon here and we've got this speed control icon here. I don't want them there, so I'm going to navigate to my M panel on my geometry node editor, click the extrude scale. I'm going to scroll down and I'll change the structure type from auto to single. I'll do the same for speed control. I'm going to change it from auto to single. Maybe we can clean up the geometry nodes a bit. So I'm going to select this group input node. I'm going to hit Control H and that will hide any unused sockets. And maybe for this offset scale, I'm going to hit Shift A. I'll search for group and we'll choose group input. And the offset scale was the extrude scale. So I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to plug this extrude scale into the offset scale of the extrude mesh. I'll then hit Control H and that will hide any unused sockets. I'll select this group input node. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate and I'll bring this over to here. This one here was the curve radius, so I'm going to zoom in. I'll connect this curve radius socket into the radius socket of the curve circle. I'll then hit Control H and that will hide any unused sockets. I'm going to do the same for this icosphere radius. So I'll select this node here. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate. I'm going to connect the icosphere radius to the radius of the icosphere node. I'll then hit Control H to hide any unused sockets. Maybe I can just drag these across over to here. Drag this across. Just drag these across. Or drag this across. Okay. And I'll also do the same for the speed control. So I'm going to select the group input. I'm going to hit Shift D. Just drag this over to here. And your speed control will plug into the bottom socket of the multiply node. I hit Control H to hide any unused sockets. I'll pop that down there. And now I can just drag this up here. Excellent. So it all looks a bit neater now. I'll just hit N to hide the N panel. And in my geometry node window, I'm just going to hit Control Space just so you can see the final node tree. Control Space to exit out of full screen. Now we just need to finish up with the scene. So I'm just going to go into viewport shading. I hit Shift A, I'm going to go Mesh, and I'm going to choose Plane. I'll then tab into Edit Mode. I'm going to hit S5, Enter. I'll then tab out of Edit Mode. I'm going to hit Numpad 1 to go into Front View. I'll then hit G for Grab. I'm going to hold down Control to grab it in increments. I'll then hold down Shift to grab it in finer increments. And I'm just going to drag it down to around about there. I'll then hit Numpad 7. I'm going to hit Control Alt Numpad 0, and that will align my camera to the viewport. I'm going to select my camera. I'm going to ensure on my Object Data tab over here, the X and Y is set to 0, and the rotation for X, Y and Z is also set to 0. But maybe I can increase the Z location to, let's say, 5 meters, maybe 7. Okay, that looks good. Select the ground plane. I'm going to go to my Material tab over here. I'm going to click this button and I'm going to choose Material A. I'll then select my Geometry Node text object. And in the Geometry Nodes window here, I'm going to rename the Geometry Nodes to Trace MoGraph Geotext. Maybe I can copy that name, Control C. I'll navigate to my outliner and I'll replace the name of the default cube to Trace MoGraph Geotext. Before you move on, it's a good idea to save your project. So I'm going to go to File, Save As, and I'm going to save mine as Like and Subscribe. Thanks folks, you absolute legends. And then click Save As. I'm just going to go into rendered view just to make sure everything's working. Maybe I'll disable my overlays. So you can adjust the colours to your personal preference. I've chosen orange and blue because they're complementary colours and I really like the palette. You can go to your modifier tab over here, and with your settings you can change the size of the icospheres, you can change the curve radius, you can change the speed of the animation, the extrude scale. Basically you've got access to all your settings here. Don't forget, in your shader editor you can adjust the brightness of each of your materials. That's a bit bright, so I'm going to probably change this to, let's say, 10, maybe 25. Okay, I quite like the look of that. And if I skip back to frame 1, it's going to look completely different. As I push play, you can kind of see what's happening. Looks pretty cool. So I'm just going to skip to a random frame, maybe something around there perhaps. I'll then navigate to my render settings tab over here. I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to keep my noise threshold set to 0.01. If you want yours to render faster, you can increase this number to like 0.025 or 0.05. I'm going to set my max samples to, let's say, 256. I might increase that for my final. I'll then navigate to lights over here and I'll disable light tree. I'm going to scroll down to where it says light paths, expand these options. I'll disable reflective and refractive caustics. I'll then navigate to my output tab over here. And under the output options over here, you can click this folder, choose a file location where you want to save your image sequence, and then click accept. Choose a file format of your choice. Usually I'd go with a format of OpenEXR with a codec of DWAA lossy, and that will decrease your file size whilst increasing your dynamic range. But for this tutorial, I'm just going to change this to PNG. I'll change the color from RGBA to RGB. I'm going to go into solid view. I'll enable my overlays. I'm going to select my camera. I'm going to hit Ctrl S to save the project. I'll then hit F12 to render out a test frame. Okay, I'm definitely going to need to fire more samples at this, so I'll probably go with 1024. But for now, I'm just going to hit Escape. I'll then navigate to my compositing tab up here. I'll then click Use Nodes. I'll then navigate to the right, and I'll enable this View tab over here. And just ensure that you've got Backdrop enabled. I'll then click Fit. Maybe I'll decrease my timeline. I'll click Fit again. I'll then hit N to hide the end panel. I'm going to zoom in. I'll just drag this across over to here. I'm going to hit Shift A. I'm going to go Filter and I'm going to choose Glare. I'll pop that in between there. I'll then change it from Streaks to Bloom. I'm going to reduce the size to, let's say, 0.1, maybe 0.05. In fact, we'll take it down even more, so 0.02. Okay, I'm kind of happy with that. Maybe I can decrease the strength as well, so I'm going to set the strength to 0.25. Maybe I can add a vignette to this. I'll hit Shift A, I'm going to go to Mask, and we'll choose Ellipse Mask. I'm going to increase the size for the X and Y to, let's say, around about there perhaps. I'll then hit Shift A, I'm going to go Colour, and we'll choose Mix, and we'll choose Mix Colour, and I'll pop that in between there. I'm going to plug the mask into the factor of the mix colour. I'm going to take the image from the glare node and plug that into socket B. I'll then click Swatch A and change this to black. Now all we have to do is blur the mask. Shift A, go to Filter, Blur, and we choose Blur. And I'll pop that in between the ellipse mask and the mix colour node. I'm going to change it from Gaussian to Fast Gaussian. And I'm going to change the size to, let's say, 250 for the X and Y. Maybe a bit more, so I might even go 500. I'll just re-enable the ellipse mask over here. I'm going to increase the size on the X and I'm going to increase the size on the Y to something around there. Okay, I'm happy with that. I'll navigate back to my layout view over here. I'm going to go to my render tab over here. I'm going to increase the max samples to, let's say, 1024. I'll just hit F12 to render out a test frame. Okay, it looks pretty good, but I think we can do a little bit better than this. Plus, I think we need to add a few more samples. So I'm just going to hit Escape to close that window. At current, the text looks a bit flat because the camera is right above the text and we can't really see the undercarriage. So we're just going to move the camera back on the y-axis and then we're going to point it up and that will help give it a bit more depth. So I'm going to hit numpad 0 to go into camera view. I'll then navigate to my object data tab over here and just ensure that you've got your camera selected in the outliner. And then on your object data, we're going to drag the y-axis of the camera back to, let's say, -4 meters. So there's two ways of going about this. We can rotate the camera on the x-axis until we see the text. The trouble with this, it kind of warps these lines. So you can see that this line here gets narrower as it goes to the top. And the same as this one, so we've got perspective. I don't want perspective, so I'm going to set my rotation to 0 degrees. I'll then select my camera data tab over here, and I'll change the tilt shift on the y-axis, and I'm going to hold down Control and Shift to snap it in increments, and I'm going to bring it up to round about there. As you can see, where we use the tilt shift instead of rotating the camera, we can see the undercarriage of this text, giving it the 3D effect and thus giving it more depth whilst maintaining these straight lines, so there's no perspective shift. I'll then navigate to my render tab over here and I'm going to change the max samples to 4096. I hit Control S to save the project, and then it's simply a case of hitting Control F12, and that will render out your image sequence. Join me on Patreon as a free member, and you'll have access to this file alongside other Blender files from previous tutorials. That's the tutorial in a nutshell. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please click like and subscribe. It really helps my channel. Have a great day, level up, and thanks for watching.